Lesson 2.5, the United States Constitution. When the Articles of Confederation proved to be too weak, the leaders of our country decided that it needed to be fixed. Delegates met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from May 14th until September 17th, 1787, at what became known as the Constitutional Convention. Constitutional Convention, just that word Constitution with AL at the end. Constitutional Convention. And then it notes this picture here of this building. And it says the picture here is of what is now called Constitution Hall. Constitution Hall, where they met in Philadelphia. You can still visit there today. It became clear very early that simply revising or changing or fixing, the word we used earlier, the articles would not be enough. They couldn't just be fixed. They realized that it would be better to just start over from scratch. The new document would have a much stronger form of national government, which is also known as a strong central government, the national government or central government. So in America, you've got like your town, then you've got your county, then you've got your state, and then over all of the states, we have our national government at the top, or our central government. That's where our president and our Congress and all that are, okay? We needed a stronger national government or stronger central government. That was something we didn't have under the Articles. Like the Declaration of Independence, the writers of the Constitution would borrow ideas from many Enlightenment thinkers. One of these important thinkers was a French philosopher or thinker named Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu wrote that government should be split into three branches of government. It should be split, the government should be split into three different branches to keep one person or branch from becoming too powerful. This idea is called separation of powers. He believed that those branches should consist of a legislative branch to make laws, also known as legislation, which is where we get the word legislature or legislation or legislative branch. They make laws. They write laws. In our case, that would be our Congress. That's our legislative branch of Congress. An executive branch to enforce laws. And run the day-to-day operations. Think of like a CEO. CEO stands for Chief Executive Officer. They execute the plan. They are at the top. They're the head honcho, Chief Executive Officer. In our case, that would be our president. Our executive branch is made up of our president. And a judicial branch a judicial branch, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's made up of our court system, our judges, and it's their job to interpret what laws mean. That is our court system, with the Supreme Court at the top level. With the Supreme Court at the top level. Montesquieu, that's Montesquieu, believed that each branch should check, C-H-E-C-K, check, or limit the powers of the other branches in order to balance out power. This is called checks and balances. So there are certain things that each branch does to the other branches to limit their powers. For example, the legislative branch writes laws. The president, if he doesn't like a law that the legislative branch wrote, he can veto it or strike it down. What it really does is it sends it back to the legislative branch. But if enough people in the legislative branch still want it to pass, they can override the president's veto. So you see they both have that check on each other. At the same time, the legislative branch can pass a law or a bill, and then the president signs it and it becomes a law. But the judicial branch can take a look at that law and decide whether or not they think it's constitutional or not. It can be signed by the president and passed by Congress, and the judicial branch can still strike it down. So that is a check that the judicial branch has on both the executive and the legislative branch. So those are called checks and balances to make sure one person or branch doesn't become too powerful in our separation of powers in our three branches. So again, the legislative branch writes the laws or makes the laws. The executive branch, the president, executes the laws or enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. They decide what they actually mean and enforce them not enforce, but decide whether or not they're constitutional. That's called judicial reviews. We'll talk about later. So again, for example, if the legislative branch passes a law the executive or the president does not like, he can veto it, V-E-T-O, or cancel it. At the same time, if Congress wants that law to pass, if enough congressmen agree, they can override, that's one word, override the president's veto. This is very rare, though. You can remember that Montesquieu was the guy that came up with the three branches of government by remembering that his name has 3 syllables. So you remember how to do syllables? Montesquieu. He has 3 syllables in his name. He's the 3 branches of government guy. He's a separation of powers guy. What came out of this convention was a brand new document that is an instruction manual that explains the basics of how our government is set up. So you can read it, and it tells what the president is like, what the executive branch is like, what the legislative branch is like, what the judicial branch is like, what it takes to pass the law. All those things are in the Constitution. It's like an instruction manual that tells you how to put something together, okay? Our government is a democratic republic. A democratic republic, also known as a representative democracy. Representative democracy based on a concept called federalism. Federalism is where power is shared between the national or central government, and the state governments. There are certain things that the states can do that the national government can't do. And there are certain things the national government can do that the states can't do. That's called federalism. For this reason, sometimes the national or central government is called the federal government. Federal government. That's why if we are referring to national government agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, we say the feds are here. If the feds show up to your house, you're probably in trouble. Let's talk about federalism. Two groups formed as the convention dragged on, and delegates fought about what the government should look like. One group wanted the government to be stronger and do more, and the other wanted the government to basically look like it did under the Articles of Confederation, where the states had all the power and the central government had none. The Federalists realized that the Articles of Confederation were too weak and needed to totally change. The other group opposed this idea for the Constitution and wanted things to pretty much stay the same with strong state governments and a weaker central government. They were called the Anti-Federalists. A-N-T-I, the Anti-Federalists. The reason these names were used is because federalism is a system of government where there is a balance of power between the national government and the state governments, but with a strong national government. Therefore, the Federalists favored a new constitution with this type of system, and the Anti-Federalists wanted stronger states. This idea is called states' rights. States' rights. Now here's a comparison between the two groups we're talking about, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The first thing, the Federalists favored a strong national, central, or federal government and weaker state governments. And they wanted a whole new constitution that reflected that. The Anti-Federalists favored stronger state governments and a weaker national government. Basically, they wanted something similar to the Articles of Confederation, which was too weak. The Federalists believed that they believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, a loose interpretation. This meant that just because the Constitution said it, doesn't necessarily mean it can't be changed. For example, we have the right to keep and bear arms or guns in America. However, it does not say anything about a bazooka, big gun. Therefore, the Federalists would say what? Well, they would say that the founders didn't have any idea what a bazooka was. They were thinking about squirrel hunting guns and deer hunting guns, muskets, black powder guns. So the right to keep and bear arms might not have anything to do with that. So they would say, yes, you can limit people's right to have those things. However, the Anti-Federalists believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Strict. This meant that the Constitution says what it says and means exactly what it says. So, for example, we have the right to keep and bear arms or guns in America. In their mind, it would mean arms means all guns, big and small. Therefore, the Anti-Federalists would say, what about the bazooka? Well, they would say, yes, a person can have a bazooka. See, the Federalists say we can adjust to the times. The Constitution wasn't written with knowledge about the present. Anti-Federalists say it doesn't matter. Those principles never should change. The Federalists wanted to keep a government that functioned well. They were more concerned about the good of the most people, or the common good. Anti-Federalists wanted maximum freedom for individual people. For them, freedom was the most important thing. Federalists tended to live in urban areas. That means in the cities, urban. They all used public services because they lived in cities and didn't mind paying extra taxes for those services. Anti-Federalists tended to live in rural areas, R-U-R-A-L, rural areas, which means out in the country. They just wanted to have low taxes and be left alone. They didn't use the same kind of public services. Like in cities today, people use the bus. In Atlanta, they use the MARTA system, the bus, underground bus system, or train system, excuse me. They don't mind paying taxes for stuff like that. Where we live out in the country, we don't use that, so we don't want to pay taxes for stuff like that. The Federalists wrote a pamphlet supporting their side called the Federalist Papers, and it had 85 articles in it. The Anti-Federalists wrote a pamphlet called Letters from the Federal Farmer. Now, the Federalists included people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. John Adams would become our first vice president, and he would become our second president. Alexander Hamilton would become our first Secretary of the Treasury. He was really good with money. They were both Federalists. The Anti-Federalists included people like Thomas Jefferson, who was our first Secretary of State and our third president, and Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, which is that thing that helped convince people who weren't totally decided yet to go to war against England. After many months of debating, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists finally came to an agreement. The Anti-Federalists said they would support the new Constitution if the Federalists would agree to add or amend, A-M-E-N-D, add or amend 10 protected rights to the end of it. Those are called amendments. These first 10 amendments, or additions, first 10 amendments to the Constitution were called the Bill of Rights. So if I ask you what the Bill of Rights are, they're the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. We have over 20 of those now, but we had 10 back then, okay? The First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, maybe you've heard of those before. First Amendment, freedom of speech. Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, and so forth, okay? Those first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights, and the Anti-Federalists wanted those added. Remember, if you look back up here, for the Anti-Federalists, freedom was the most important thing. Individual freedom, maximum freedom for individual people. They agreed to ratify the Constitution or officially accept it if we would agree to add those 10 amendments. Okay? That was their compromise. The Federalists agreed, and the 13 former colonies ratified. It comes from the word ratify, R-A-T-I-F-Y, ratify. They ratified or officially accepted the Constitution. It took effect in 1789.